What if I told you there's a human heart, a real, physical heart, that has been sitting in a glass reliquary for over 160 years, completely untouched by decay, not fossilized, not embalmed, still whole, still soft, still entirely preserved, as if time itself had stepped back and said, "This one is different." This heart belonged to a man so holy, so completely surrendered to God, that even death could not corrupt the part of him that loved the world the most. This is the story of Saint John Vianney, the humble parish priest from a tiny village in France who became the patron saint of all priests, not because he was brilliant or powerful or even naturally gifted, but because he gave everything, including his sleep, his health, and eventually, even his body. And now, over a century and a half later, his incorrupt heart still beats a message to the modern world, not in pulses, but in silence. Born in 1786, just before the French Revolution, John Vianney grew up in a time when churches were being desecrated, priests were hunted, and belief in God was mocked as ignorance. His family had to attend Mass in secret, hidden in barns, with priests in disguise. By the time he was a young man, John knew exactly what kind of priest he wanted to be, one who would give his life entirely for God. But there was a problem. He wasn't smart, not by the world's standards. He struggled terribly with his studies, especially Latin, and was even dismissed by professors who believed he would never make it through seminary. But John didn't stop. He begged, prayed, wept, and eventually, with the help of a few merciful mentors, he was ordained in 1815. He was assigned to Ars, a remote and spiritually cold village in southeastern France, a place no one cared about, a place no one expected anything from. But heaven had other plans. From the moment he arrived, Father Vianney began living like a monk in the middle of the world. He ate almost nothing, slept only a few hours a night, and prayed for hours in the dark before the tabernacle. He spent entire days in the confessional, sometimes 15, even 18 hours without leaving, listening to the broken hearts of thousands. People traveled from across France, then all of Europe, to confess their sins to him. They said he could read souls, not just hear words, but see straight into your conscience. He would often tell a penitent their sins before they opened their mouth. Trains and carriages would line up for miles just to catch a glimpse of the curé of Ars, the priest with the radiant face and the tired eyes, who lived only for God and for the people's conversion. The devil, by the way, hated him. Vianney reported that for years he was tormented at night. His bed shook violently. Strange voices shouted in his room, and he was physically thrown to the floor. But he never gave in. He just prayed harder, loved deeper, forgave more. By the time he died in 1859, he had become one of the most beloved priests in history. Over 100,000 people attended his funeral. But perhaps the most astonishing part of his story began after his death. Years later, when his body was exhumed, something completely unexpected was discovered: his heart, still intact. Unlike the rest of the body, which showed signs of natural decay, his heart remained perfectly preserved. No decomposition, no withering, just a heart sitting there, whole and lifelike, as if it had never stopped beating. Scientists examined it, doctors analyzed it, but no one could explain why just this one organ, the very symbol of love and sacrifice, had resisted death. Today, more than 160 years later, his heart is still on public display in a golden reliquary at the shrine of Ars. Pilgrims come from all over the world to kneel before it, not out of superstition, but because when they see it, something inside them stirs. You're not just looking at a relic. You're looking at a life that burned so brightly with love that even death could not silence it. And maybe that's the point. In a world obsessed with appearance, success, and intellect, here was a man who had none of those things. He was poor, slow, unnoticed, and yet he became a beacon for millions. Why? Because he loved radically. He emptied himself in prayer, in confession, in suffering, until his very heart became an icon of Christ's mercy. And now that heart, unchanged by time, still calls to us. It calls to every priest who wonders if holiness is possible. It calls to every sinner who thinks they are too far gone. It calls to every one of us who doubts that love can endure. Because this heart, this quiet, pulsing sign in a chapel in France, says the opposite. It says holiness is real, sacrifice matters, love never dies. Maybe that's why his heart remains, not to wow scientists or prove a miracle, but to remind us that the greatest miracles are often silent, invisible, and shaped like love. So if one day you find yourself near ours, go and see it. Kneel, be still, and listen. That heart is not beating anymore, but its message still echoes. You were made to love without limits, and love like that doesn't rot. It endures forever. So in a world where even steel rusts and stone crumbles, how does a human heart, buried for over a century, remain untouched? Maybe it's just an anomaly science hasn't caught up to yet. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder. A question written not in words, but in flesh. What kind of life must you live for even death to hesitate? Whether you believe in miracles or not, it's hard to deny that something extraordinary is preserved in that little French village, not just a relic, but a memory of love lived without limits. So let me ask you, what would it take for your life to leave a mark that time itself can't erase? Could it be that the most powerful force in the world isn't brilliance or beauty, but sacrifice? Quiet, hidden, stubborn love that keeps giving long after the world forgets your name? You don't have to answer now, just sit with the question. Sometimes the mystery is the message. What if I told you there's a small church in the middle of America, forgotten by time, scarred by fire, nearly torn down, and yet it has become the site of over 30,000 miraculous healings, with testimonies recorded and stacked in silence, like prayers etched into paper. No bright signs, no television cameras, just a quiet space where the impossible seems to keep happening. This isn't a medieval shrine in Europe or a famous basilica built on ancient ruins. It's St. Joseph's Shrine in St. Louis, Missouri, and if the stories are true, then something holy, something unexplainable is still happening there. The church was founded in 1846, built by German immigrants who brought their faith across the ocean and laid brick by brick the only thing they had left: hope. Over time, the neighborhood around it changed. Factories closed, people moved away. The church suffered fires, debt, even demolition threats. At one point, only a few faithful old women were showing up to pray, but they never stopped. They lit candles, they whispered rosaries, and somewhere in the midst of those forgotten prayers, the extraordinary began to stir. In 1864, during a cholera epidemic, a man named Ignatius Strecker was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He was given up by doctors and brought to the church to prepare for death. But before the priest could administer last rites, Ignatius began to cry out, not in pain, but in joy. His strength returned, his fever vanished, and within hours he stood up and walked home. The doctors were stunned, the newspapers ran the story, and the people came, by the thousands. They came carrying canes and wheelchairs, wrapped in grief and desperation, clutching photographs and letters of loved ones, and many, not all, but many left without the burdens they came with. Tumors disappeared, vision returned. Children who couldn't walk began to run, and the records grew. piles of handwritten testimonies, medical reports, letters of gratitude, now over 30,000, stored and preserved as witness to something the church itself couldn't explain but couldn't deny. No one claimed it was a place of magic. There was no golden statue bleeding or apparitions flashing in the sky. Just Saint Joseph, silent foster father of Jesus, standing in stone behind the altar, watching over every whisper of faith. And the people believed he was answering. That he still is. Because even today, long after the glory faded and the world forgot about this quiet pocket of Missouri, people are still coming, still lighting candles, still kneeling, still healed. And scientists, doctors, they've reviewed the files, examined the x-rays, measured before and after scans. Many say they simply don't know what happened. Others try to explain it away with coincidence or placebo or mass psychology. But some pause. Some say, this doesn't make sense, but it happened. And maybe that's the point. Because in a world obsessed with data and proof, this place invites something older. Wonder, faith, that quiet, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, we're not alone. Maybe heaven sometimes leans a little closer, and maybe a carpenter from Nazareth, silent as ever, is still listening, still answering. So the next time you drive through Missouri, don't look for signs. Just look for a church that refused to die, a people who refused to stop believing, and a shrine where over 30,000 stories are still waiting to be told. And then ask yourself, what would it take for you to believe in something bigger than what your eyes can see? Not because someone told you to, but because somewhere deep inside, your soul whispered, maybe. Maybe this is one of those places where miracles still walk quietly among us, barefoot, unnoticed, and real.